Hello, everyone. Hopefully,
Welcome.
I have the audio on this week. I bet you I do. I will find out when it starts streaming and I see it. We have about a 10-second to 15-second delay, but I see the little thing moving. But anyhow, we are here this week and we're mixing it up. We have a slightly different topic than usual, which is so you play D&D and you're thinking of playing Pathfinder. What do you need to know? How do you convert over? And the reason we decided to do this topic is because we see a lot of people asking this question on the Pathfinder forum in Reddit. And we thought
Especially recently.
Yeah, especially
it's
recently.
it's great. There's just a lot of people who are interested and they're posting and they're asking questions and they're very open to hearing. And so we thought we could bring on Dave from How It's Played, who's kind of an expert on streaming about learning the game and tell people what some of the common info you need to know.
Yes, Dave knows more about the rules than everyone on this planet except for Mark.
And Logan.
Logan.
Probably Logan, and I don't know if I would label myself an expert. I kind of feel like Alex Trebek. He always has the answers on the cards.
Okay.
And when I make those videos, I have the answers in a book in front of me.
So Dave, this is the first time on the show. We've been mixing it up. We're trying to get new people, but we've known Dave for a long time, and we were like, hey, you know what? We should get you on the show. And you have equipment. You know how to record. You know how to do this. So we're like, yeah.
He has the technology.
Pretty much.
Yes, and thank you for having me. And yes, to everybody out there who may not be familiar with me, I do operate a YouTube channel called How It's Played, and it's dedicated to explaining the rules of a number of different role-playing games, but mostly Paizo games like Starfinder and Pathfinder 2nd Edition. So if you're not familiar with it, come check it out, How It's Played.
Yeah, he goes through in detail how various rules work in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. It's a great channel, and I would go to it more often if I didn't have Mark at my disposal, because I just write Mark whenever I have a question. I'm like, Mark, how does this rule work? And usually he writes me back.
Not everyone can hire me.
That's true.
To do that.
That's true. But it has been handy because now we just had a fight the other day with a 15th level monster. And I was like, damn, man, we're getting close to the end. Not really. They go past 20. They still got up to 25. But the rules get pretty hairy once you get up to the top levels in Pathfinder. But still very balanced. Still very, very balanced. Very interesting, very challenging, and it has not been Rocket Tag, which I'm very surprised and happy to see so far. So we're gonna jump right into the topic this week and what you need to know about Pathfinder if you play D&D. Now, we're going to assume that for the topic of this discussion, that you have never played Pathfinder 2nd Edition, maybe even never even played Pathfinder 1st Edition, and just have played Dungeons & Dragons. And when I say Dungeons & Dragons, I'm going to assume 5th Edition, maybe you played 4th or 3.5, or maybe even 2nd or 1st back in the day. And for whatever reason, whether you would just want to try something new, or you've heard all about this Pathfinder, or you've played 5e and you're kind of getting bored with it and you just want to see what else is out there. And we're going to talk about it from the point of view of both players as well as GMs. And in Pathfinder, they're called GMs. I know in D&D, they're called DMs. So there's something different right there. And if anyone has any questions or comments, the regulars for Roll for Combat, please ask us in the stream. And of course, anyone who does a super chat or joins will get highest priority and we'll answer them right away. So keep that in mind.
And we'll try to look especially for questions. If there's anyone here who is a D&D player who's thinking of playing Pathfinder and is in the chat, we'll try to get to those pretty expeditiously as well.
So right off the bat, what would you say is, I don't know, the first thing people need to keep in mind if they're coming from 5th edition 5e and they're like, I want to get into Pathfinder, I'm familiar with 5e. I've played a few games. What do I need to do? Like, what basically from day one, it's like, and I see that a lot. Like, do they need to buy books? Is everything online? Do they need to buy the starter set? Do they need to buy the core rule book? Like, what should they do right away?
I think you're asking the right first question, because we want to look at things from kind of a top-down approach. And the first thing isn't like going into a mechanical minutia. It is like literally, what do you need? What resources are there? So first of all, you can go on Archives of Nethys or a variety of other places and just get all of the rules, look at all of the rules for free. And that is very handy. It's a good resource to learn about the rules. I feel like when you're learning the game, it's a little easier to have the book because sometimes like the hyperlinks and seeing where to go is easier as like a rules reference. But if you don't have the money to drop to check it out, you can use websites to learn. Mm-hmm. If you want to check it out and you're willing to buy something, I suggest the beginner box, because it's very specifically made to make it easy for you to get into it. It has the rules that you need to play. It only has a little bit in terms of character options. It's not a different game. It's the same game, but simplified down in terms of the character building components and like a few of the rules in play that are like pretty uncommonly used or only happen during substantial periods of downtime are just not in there. And then basically you can play that and then port your character over with very little effort into just playing the full game afterwards. And so I would recommend the beginner box by a lot. If not, then keep in mind that the core rulebook basically has all of the basic Dungeon Master's Guide and Player's Handbook information in it. There is separately a Game Master's Guide that has like advanced and really cool extra stuff for GMs, but all the basic stuff from both sides of the equation are actually in the core rulebook.
Yeah, and that's actually something I hear a lot from players who come to my table from 5e to Pathfinder 2nd Edition. They see the Pathfinder 2nd Edition core rulebook and they see the size of it, and they think, holy cow, this is ridiculous, it's huge. But a lot of content in the Pathfinder 2nd Edition core rulebook would be considered DM guide, DMG material in 5e. So it's not quite as overwhelming to see that larger core rulebook as I think some people believe. And pretty much everybody who comes to my Pathfinder games from 5e have this preconceived notion that Pathfinder is much more complex. And the sight of a larger rule book only seems to validate that belief for them. But the reality is the book is larger because it's got a lot of stuff in it that you would find in your DMG. And yeah, I'm sure as we go through, we'll probably talk a little bit about the complexity differences as well. But don't let the size of the core rule book be anything to dissuade you from joining Pathfinder 2nd Edition, I guess is the point I'm looking at making there.
Yeah, to piggyback off of that, I would say that supposing that you're, for whatever reason, you're not going to use the beginner box, which really has just a tiny little pamphlet of just exactly what you need. But maybe like somebody bought you the core rulebook and you just already have it, or you got it yourself. And then you checked out this video and you realized, oh, well, I guess I don't have the beginner box. What should I do with the core rulebook? The core rulebook is written and organized in a way to make it a great reference for you, especially if you're character building. A lot of the chapters after the introduction go through the things you need to build your character in the order you would need to build the character. But that doesn't necessarily mean it is organized in a way that makes it best for you if you're just like, I don't know anything. What should I do? So here's my recommendation. You have the core rulebook, you don't have the beginner box, and you're just starting. Read the introduction first. That is, there's a recent Reddit post breaking down the percentages. So that's only first 5% of the book. So that's, how long is the book? It's around 600 pages or so. So that means that would be like 30 pages. So you read the introduction. then skip entirely and read the rules of playing the game. That's about the same length. It's a little bit longer. And it's closer toward the end of the book, but that's like the basic rules of the game. Also, you probably need to know the skills. Those are pretty short. They're only 3% of the book. It is actually normally the 4th chapter. That's all you need. If you're also the game master, read Game Mastering. That's a little longer than any of the other sections we mentioned before. But even if you were the game master reading Game Mastering, that would be 22% of the book, less than a quarter of the length. And all the rest of it is stuff you need for character building. It's reference material. It's spells, which make up almost as many pages just of spells as all of the pages I just told you to read, right? It's classes, which actually are longer for just the chapter of all the classes is longer than all of the pages that I just said to read. And you only need those for building your character. And you may only need like portions of those. If you know you want to play a dwarf fighter or some kind of dwarven fighter-like character, then you can probably just go to dwarf and go to fighter, and you don't need to read those whole chapters necessarily right at the beginning.
Yeah, something to keep in mind is that D&D has a tradition of having the player's guide and the dungeon master's guide and the monster manual all separate. And it's something they've continued along these lines. And if you ever look at Amazon, the player's guide has continuously been one of the best-selling books ever of all time in history. But not the DM's guide. The DM's guide, if you think about it, in theory, there's something like, 4 to 5 players for every person who DMs. So, they think of it, well, everyone's going to be buying the DM's guide. Sorry, everyone's going to be buying the player's guide, but not everyone's going to need the DM's guide. Ironically, everyone does buy the monster manual, though, no matter who you are, because that's just people love monsters. Pathfinder does just about everyone. Back when I was a kid, I'd say everyone did, because it was more fun. The way Pathfinder does it, they do a little differently. They put almost everything you need into one book. And that's why it's so big. They don't divide it up into separate books, which is not completely true, because there are a million additional books that Pathfinder uses that can go into additional details, but you don't need to worry about those right now. You can completely ignore all those books, so don't worry about them. If you get overwhelmed and you go to the bookstore, remember those? Or you go online and you see all these Pathfinder books, you can just get the beginner's box, and that's it. And the beginner's box has something that's fantastic in it, which is it has a solo adventure, which is great, because how many times have you gotten the books and you got your box and you're like, this is great, but I need to find someone to play with? Well, you can play all by yourself. You can do a mini adventure and get a feel right away for what it's like to play Pathfinder. And then it has everything you need. It's very, very, very well done. It's very easy to use. It's very colorful. You can just jump into it. Even the DM could just look at it, read it for maybe 30 minutes, an hour, and figure out how to play. And more importantly, if you know how to play D&D, you'll have a leg up, because there's very similar concepts. Combat still works more or less the same. It's a little different here and there. Spells work more or less the same. The way DM does their job is more or less the same. Adventures look pretty much the same. The nitty gritty of the 3-action economy and things like that are different, but they will be easily explained, and you'll figure those out right away or within just a few rounds of combat. It's designed to also be very forgiving, in the sense that this is your first game, and if you make a mistake, then just fix it. You don't need to be perfect. This is not the SATs or something. You don't have to worry about making a mistake in your rolls and you're using the wrong, pluses or bonuses when you were doing your rolls. Don't worry about it. Seriously, just get in there, try it out, and play it, and you'll get the hang of it pretty quick. And then you can get into the more advanced topics if you really like what you say.
Yeah, and something that you mentioned that I think is worth reinforcing is there's so much of 5e that is transferable to Pathfinder 2nd edition. One of the things I've heard before and read on people say on Reddit when asked about what advice you would give if I'm wanting to move from 5e to Pathfinder Second Edition, the phrase comes up: "Forget everything you know," and I disagree with that so much. It's not a situation of forget everything you know about 5e. I had a 5e player come to one of my games, and we got in the first combat. He had a pre-gen character, said he was playing a fighter. So I was like, okay, well, make your attack roll. And he said, well, I mean, I don't know how to play Pathfinder. What I roll? It's like, well, you just look at your sheet and it says, 1d20 plus a number, and that's going to be opposed by an armor class. And the light bulb went off in his head, and he was, it instantly made these connections of he doesn't have to forget everything he knows about 5e, because there's still saving throws, and there's still armor class, there's still hit points. Now there are nuances and things that are different, but it has the same heritage. Both 5e and Pathfinder, intersect at D&D Third Edition, basically. And I've grown from there and sort of cousins. So I don't feel like you have to learn everything new. There's going to be a lot of information you can transfer from your background at 5e to Pathfinder.
I think that's a really important thing to say, Dave, because it is true. A lot of people are like, well, forget everything, you're blocking yourself off. And I would say, I would rephrase it. I don't think that they're wrong. I think that they're just coming on a little too strong. I think that what you said is correct. They should challenge their assumptions. You should challenge your assumptions from 5e, because they may not all be accurate, but you should still remember all of it. Because a lot of things are going to be like the same, and they're going to be the same in the same way, like armor class. Armor class is a very strangely worded term that most games do not use that exact wording, and both D&D and Pathfinder do, and it means exactly the same thing. It's a target number that you're trying to hit with, like you said, Dave, when you roll d20 and add the modifier. So some of that core DNA of the games is very, very similar, and it's completely transferable. You just kind of don't lock in an assumption that something is exactly the same, and be open to reading the definition of something that you thought that you knew what it was, just in case there's something a little bit different. But you can generally get by in a lot of cases with the fact that it's the same or similar.
So with that, let's say you decided to jump in. You have what you need to start playing. You have your characters, but you need to find people to play with, which is now the second issue that often comes up.
Right.
And what do you recommend in terms, especially in the age of COVID now? It's interesting. It's, it's like in the old days, you could often go to a store and maybe, find some pickup games. Obviously, if you're in a school environment, it's a lot easier to find a game or even just post for a game. But if you're a working professional or you're older, how would you go about looking for a game? I will start off while you guys think. One way you could do it, in my opinion, is very easily, if you ever want to go to a game convention, if you feel bold enough to go, and trust me, I've gone to plenty. I'm going to PaizoCon this week. You go to PaizoCon, you can go to Origins, you go to Gen Con, you can go to any other smaller convention, Dragon Con, you name it. If there's a gaming convention near you, they will usually have Pathfinder games. It's not all D&D, trust me. In fact, there'll be games there you've never heard of, role-playing games that I guarantee you've never, ever heard of, ever. And you're like, people are playing them. Well, I guarantee you'll be able to find Pathfinder games. And those are good places. And they'll often have beginner games, especially at the bigger cons, where it's learn to play. And they'll have experienced GMs who are there specifically for new players to help them out. But something else is that one nice thing of being the little fish or the smaller fish in the big pond compared to 5e is that Pathfinder players and GMs are pretty friendly, I'd say, as a whole. And they always want to get more people playing Pathfinder. So I'd say 9 times out of 10, if you just sit into a brand new game with someone who, and you're obviously new to it, the other players and GM will be very, very helpful. And they'll show you how to play it. They'll show you the differences. They'll sit down, explain it to you. they will embrace you and help you out. So you don't have to worry about being, oh, you play D&D, well, we don't want you here. That just doesn't happen. I've never seen that personally. So that's something else to keep in mind, that the Pathfinder community is, as a whole, very, very nice and very inviting.
Yeah, I would say even that in the age of COVID, or like in this day and age, it's actually a little easier to find games than it was before. When I was just starting out at college, and I was at MIT, where you would think you would find a ton of games, of tabletop role playing games. It was actually not easy to find a game, and it took me several years. I started my own game eventually, and that was mainly for a lot of factors, such as the fact that there was like a major LARPing club, and that took a lot of people with cross interests. So then there were fewer people who were running like tabletop games. There wasn't a big place to go. But nowadays, like, you can go onto a number of Discords, even Roll for Combat's Discord that, we're hosting this show. And you can find tons of games online, because online play has really picked up. There's an organized play online Discord for Pathfinder that has an enormous number of people from countries all over the world, pretty much any time zone. And it's pretty easy to find games, especially games of organized play, which is something called Pathfinder Society. And they have little one-shot adventures, but with your character is persistent and levels up and gets stronger, like D&D Adventures League, if you've played that. And so that's a great way to dip your toes in. And if you tell them, hey, I'm new, I'm coming from D&D, they will go out of their way to find you welcoming people, or GMs who are skilled and know how to help new players. So any of those places are a great place to start looking for games, assuming that you're okay playing online. Like Stephen, you were talking about finding people around you who, so you might have been looking to have people find people who can play face to face, and that's still some of the same old ways are still the good ways for that, I think.
Yeah, for me, I live in a fairly rural area, and we don't have like friendly local game stores here. We don't have, the places you can go to that have the side room with the 20 tables, and you spend your day there. And I'm a curmudgeonly old man who doesn't use Discord, so my options are limited, right? Where I found success is through meetup.com. For the last 10 years, we've pretty much stuck with the core group, but so many people that are in my gaming group and other groups that I sat in on are games that were formed on meetup.com and were advertised there. And I would recommend giving that a look. I would say if your area isn't showing any gaming on that service, you might have to be the person who has to say, I'm going to GM and I'm going to be the one to post it. And if your area is like mine, if you post it, they will show up. You will get bites. There's a lot of people out there who are interested. Now, one that I'll throw to either of you, because I've never used it, but I've heard people using it, is Warhorn. Have either one of you had any experience with a Warhorn?
Yes. We use Warhorn a lot. Linda and I were organizers back when we were in the Boston area. Warhorn is, I would say, not necessarily like a site that I associate with somebody who doesn't really know anything about the scene and is trying to gather together just a complete pickup group to do a long-term campaign. But it is an amazing event organizing site for like, oh, there's a local convention. And Steven said, you might want to check those out, right? Well, let's see if it has a Warhorn page. Oh, it does. Look at this. Here are every game that is going to be run at that local convention and all the times. And it says who's at the table and sometimes like what type of character they're bringing. So, oh wow, this one is like all clerics and wizards. Maybe I'm this person who wanted to make the dwarven fighter that I mentioned earlier. Maybe my dwarven fighter would be really appreciated in this one or something like that. So it's great for GMs and players to know like how many people are signed up, because it'll like notify you if someone drops out and it puts in a wait list. But it's not necessarily the tool I would use if I was just like, I'm a new player and I want to find like a campaign to play this like level 1 to 20 adventure path. Like maybe there are things like that on there but when I was using, I didn't really see a lot of that. I wouldn't consider that the same for that. So it's very good for picking up games at conventions or events.
So something else that's probably a little different that you will learn when you start playing Pathfinder. Let's say now you've played a game or two and you're like, okay, I really like this. Now what? Like, it's like I've decided that we're going to play a small campaign. Like, we have decided we'll give this a go. Maybe we'll play for a couple of months and see where this leads us. And one of the nice things about Pathfinder is, well, quite frankly, Paizo, which writes Pathfinder, puts out a gargantuan amount of product for you. And if you need adventures, if you need lore, if you need more game tools, more spells, you pretty much name it, it's there. And the good news is, except for like adventures and stuff, a lot of it's free and a lot of it's online. So if you are interested in a new class that is not in the core rule book that you have to buy a separate book for, you can see all the rules for the class online at Archives and Nethys. You don't need to buy the book. You can actually, in fact, you can also use something like Path Builder, which is a very popular free tool that allows you to build characters from level 1 to 20. And they have all the character classes on there, including some third-party, like Roll for Combat. And you can try them out. And then if you like it, you can buy the books. And usually the books have lore and other information, which is an open source, which means that everyone's allowed to use it for free. You have to purchase some materials. And then when it comes to adventures themselves, there's a lot of adventures. Every single month, Paizo puts out new adventures via their Adventure Path system. So if you want to try out an adventure where you're playing guards, and there's Agents of Edgewatch, if you want to try and just do some dungeon delving, there's the absolutely fantastic Abomination Vaults, which is a great adventure that will take you from like level 1 to approximately 10, I think, 11. And that's a great adventure. So, there's one that mixes guns and fantasy, the Outlaws of Alkenstar. So there's something for everyone. And there's also single modules like the old days that if you just want to get a module, there's modules out there. And more importantly, if you are comfortable with third-party material, like most people who play 5e are, there is obviously the Pathfinder Infinity out now, which it's very much like DM's Guild, but it's for Pathfinder, where you can find third-party materials written by fans, or you can buy stuff from third-party people like ourselves, Roll for Combat, which we have lots of fun books out there. If you want to play a dragon or go on an adventure path in a fantasy Hawaii type Polynesian setting, playing pirates, you can do that. But the point is that the world of Pathfinder is just as rich and detailed and big as 5e. So it's not like, okay, this is great. What can I do with this now? Am I going to run out of content in a couple of weeks or a couple of months? The answer is you will never, ever, ever, ever run out of content for the rest of your life times 10 if you start that road of Pathfinder, which is either a good thing or a bad thing, however you want to look at it.
Well, and that's an excellent point. There's two sides to that, right? Having the wealth of material available is a plus. If you're a new person coming in, it can be overwhelming, especially when you look at character options. Because I think one of the one of the tentpole uh, features of Pathfinder that people point to when they compare it to 5e is that there are far, far, far more character options available. You have more flexibility with building your character. You are more likely to be able to tailor a character exactly the way you want it. And when you level up, you're going to be making decisions like at every level. There's not like a level where you just raise your hit points and that's basically it. You're going to be choosing new feats. You're going to be doing new things with your characters. And one of the things I've heard from my players who have come to my table from 5e is they are overwhelmed when it's time for them to build their characters and level up their characters. There's way, way, way I won't say too many options, but there is information overload for them. And so I like to have for those people, there's two options I always present. The first is a philosophy called Core Plus One. And Core Plus One just means you limit yourself to using the core rule book and one other related book. So I don't have to look at all the material. And if I'm using Path Builder, you can go into the settings and say, we're going to only view and see options from the core rule book and one other book that may be related. If I'm making a wizard, maybe I'll also include Secrets of Magic, whatever. Or just limit yourself to the core rule book, because I guarantee you can make a very satisfying character from 1 to 20 with only using the information in the core rulebook. The other thing that I suggest, and this isn't something I would really suggest to someone who's brand new trying for the first time, but a company called Beetle and Grimm's produces these books called Character Chronicles. And the Character Chronicles are basically the core rulebook tailored for one only class. So if you know you want to play a fighter, you can get the Character Chronicle, and it has all the information for the fighter in the core rulebook, all the information about fighters from the Advanced Player's Guide, several other options included that's all tailored to the fighter. And you don't have to thumb through spells for druids and, feats for champions. It's just tailored for you. That the expense of those may be more than you want to get into if you're just trying the system. But if you're facing that too many options, information overload, those are two possible ways to handle it.
Yeah, one thing I'll say real quick, Path Builder allows you to build your character from level 1 to 20, but then you can go back and run your character as, like, say, level 3. So you can build out your character all the way to level 20 if you want, or even just branch it and do different builds of your character if you feel like exploring it and seeing how your character will build over time, because I know a lot of people like to do that. And one of the nice things is then you can say, okay, let me go back to level 2 or 3 or 4 and play my character at that level. So some other tools I know don't let you do that very easily, but that's a huge plus. And personally, I'm not a character, well, ever. I always GM. So that's what I hear my players love, and they use that all the time.
You're quite a character, Steven.
I am quite a character, but I don't actually play a character on TV. What about you, Mark? Do you have any suggestions? I'm like, now I want to start playing, and we want to do a game for, we want to try out a game like, levels, 1 through 3, 1 through 5,
Right.
Or would you recommend that maybe they start at level 3 or
I
even
think level 1?
Level 1's fine.
They should start at level 1.
Okay.
Get things started, learn things a little bit at a time. And like I said before, I recommend the beginner box. But Path Builder is also a pretty good suggestion, because you can use Path Builder as a replacement for that, like 80% of the book that I previously told you that you didn't have to read.
Right.
Like I said before, you can skip to the dwarf and the fighter if you want to be a dwarf fighter, but you can just not read any of it if you read those few pages that I mentioned and then go on Path Builder and start clicking around on some of the options. You'll find that unlike in D&D, where kind of all the feats are just like, well, if I skip my ability score increase, I'll take a feat. The feats in Pathfinder are kind of siloed into particular categories that you take at particular times. And because of this, a tool like Path Builder will tell you when you need to take each of those feats. It's listed in the character progression, but you'll find that even though, yes, there are hundreds and hundreds of feats in Pathfinder, you're never at a stage where it's like, oh no, I need to pick between hundreds of choices. But you might be building a first level champion and you're like, oh, okay, there's however many, there's maybe like 8 to 10 first level champion feats, 6 of which require a particular cause, which is kind of like the different types of paladin in D&D, where so you couldn't possibly use the 5 that were from a cause that you aren't. So there's really only like 4 things that you're picking between when you get down to it. Path Builder is a visualization that will make that easier to see, possibly, than seeing it in the pages of the book. But and that's even if you include all of the books that have come out combined, and you just don't check off any of the options, and you're like, yeah, Path Builder showed me everything. Your particular champion, your paladin, may only have like 4 feats to choose from in that particular slot. And then maybe because you're playing a puppet, which is like a little living doll, or a leshy, you then get a feat for your ancestry too. Whereas with races in D&D, you wouldn't have a choice for what abilities you get. So you're, oh no, that's more choices. But when you look at first level, there might be like 5 choices. So it's a lot more digestible.
Mm-hmm.
If you do it piece by piece. And so a program like Path Builder could be a good way to get that extra 78% of the book, so that you just never actually read that part of the book unless you have to.
So we have the person who helped write Pathfinder right next to me, Mr. Mark Seifter, one of the
That's true.
co-authors.
We didn't mention that earlier.
We should have probably mentioned that earlier.
Yeah,
is that
I'm a co-creator of Pathfinder's second edition. We had 4 people on the design team, and one of those 4 people was me. I wrote a huge percentage of the final core rule book.
Huge percentage. We'll just leave it at that.
It was a lot.
It was a lot. So having you here, one thing I wanted to touch on, now we'll get into slightly more advanced topics. I'm not going to go into, the difference between 5e and Pathfinder is this, but I will go into, there are some philosophies, I would say, that will help make your Pathfinder games go a little smoother. And one of them I can think off the top of my head when you created Pathfinder is that no one character seems to have the ability to sort of do everything. Is that this game is almost designed on purpose that you have to act as a party and you have to help and support each other. Even if you don't play a support class like a bard or something, you really have to help out each other, because no one character is the jack of all trades. No matter how hard they try, they just can't do everything. And the game was pretty much built so that I've seen this with even experienced people who play Pathfinders, when they went in and they were all playing and doing their own thing. It can be very hard specifically talking about combat, is that combat can be very hard. And as soon as they start coordinating and talking and working together, it's like a light bulb goes off and they realize, wow, it's almost like these characters were built to support each other. And the answer, at least from what I believe, is yes, that's right. That's built into the core assumption of the Pathfinder rules. Am I wrong, Mark?
So when you say it's almost like it's built that way, no, it is intentionally built that way.
Okay.
And definitely in my D&D games that I've played in and run, and in my Pathfinder first edition games, there were, like most combats, unless the GM really, really amped it up, where like 1 or 2 of the players could just do it all, they would win. So it just really depended on who went first, or whether or not players were willing to spend resources or do the you're not worthy of seeing my true power thing. And just like where the wizard was like, I could end this entire encounter, but we have fighters and stuff for that, so I'll do a cantrip and save my spells. So Pathfinder second edition is not like that, and you're right about that. it was intentionally designed, and this is something that in general actually benefits you as a new player as long as you're cognizant of it. Is in designed not to have that kind of ivory tower mindset where you have to make some kind of complicated build and ignore a bunch of feats that are going to make your character just way worse if you take them, and take certain like necessary tax feats. A good example of this in earlier editions of Dungeons and Dragons, like not even 5th edition, which doesn't have as many feats, but maybe 3.5 or Pathfinder first, was archery, where there were like 3 or 4 feats that if you took them, your damage as an archer would be like 5 to 6 times as much as someone who didn't take them and took any other feats than that. And so we don't have things like that in Pathfinder 2nd edition. There aren't like, there's some combos with like 1 level dips in D&D 5e that will just get you outrageously high amounts of power, and there are much fewer of those. But in exchange, like you said, Stephen, you need to use tactics, and it doesn't all have to be about teamwork, although teamwork really helps, and it's good to have a diverse party group. That's something we wanted, because we wanted like your traditional mixed party group with lots of different kinds of classes to be strong, as opposed to like everybody is just a caster and we just win kind of meta that you could have in some other similar games. So it's a lot about getting a good mixed group. It's a lot about working together, but it can also just be about being tactical in general. That leads into another thing I wanted to say, that I'll say briefly, which is in D&D, you don't take a penalty if you just keep attacking over and over again, at least in 5e. If you played earlier versions, you did take a penalty on later attacks. In Pathfinder, you do take a penalty on future attacks. And a lot of people are like, wait, why am I taking a penalty there? And there's a philosophical reason that you do, and that is to make it so that eventually doing something else is strategically fun and useful, because we want your first attack of the turn to always be a no-brainer move. It's like, of course I'm going to do my first attack. I like to attack. Do we do a second attack? Well, maybe it's at a penalty. What about the third attack? That's at a huge penalty. We wanted to make sure that penalty was so high that maybe like, scaring them with intimidation, or doing a feint, or moving around, or tumbling, trying just something like that could become a viable option, even if it obviously wasn't balanced against your best attack. Obviously, you're going to do your best attack. And so that's sort of where tactics come in. You ask yourself, okay, maybe I don't want to do the attack with the huge penalty. What else am I going to do? How am I going to mix things up? Can I support my party by debuffing the enemy, by changing my position on the battlefield? And that's how it gets a little more tactical. And so like kind of a mistake you might make when we were talking about before, things are pretty much the same, but question your assumptions, would be to like just stand right next to the monster and swing your sword. And anytime you get more action, oh, you've been hasted. Okay, I'll swing my sword again. But if you think about things and mix things up with the different actions, that can help.
Yeah. One of the things I think I'd like to touch on relevant to this is I've heard people say Pathfinder is more hard. It's a harder game. And I don't like that term. What I tend to fall back on is it's a game of consequences. There's real consequences to making mistakes in Pathfinder that in my experience playing 5th edition, I didn't see. And when I had players from 5e come into my game, early on, we had a couple of TPKs. And those TPKs could be traced back to decisions made by players who were used to behaving very carelessly in combat. And so they were doing things like opening other doors in the middle of a fight and aggroing more people in or splitting up, all those things that they were used to doing in 5e. And the biggest consequence was really, well, we just got to take a long rest and get all of our hit points back at once, is now something that has actual consequences to those decisions. And they have to be more tactfully minded, I guess that's a word, than what they were accustomed to in 5e. But at the same time, I don't want to paint 5e or Pathfinder as solely a tactics game, because it's not. It still has all of the role playing, the social play, all of that is still in there. But if you are the person who's used to just running wild and free in 5e, and the worst consequences, maybe you get knocked down to almost zero health or unconscious, that could be a TPK in Pathfinder.
Yeah, I would say one thing I've seen people are surprised about with Pathfinder, and I know the philosophical reason behind this is that it's not necessarily a harder game, but it is, I don't know, there's a way of saying it, but it's a little harder. It's harder than 5e, I'll put it that way. And what I mean by harder is that the math and the systems behind it are much tighter, more balanced. And by having a very balanced system, in 5e, I've heard many stories of people who are like 7th level that fight a 20th level monster and kill it. If you try that in Pathfinder, you will all die. It doesn't matter. I guarantee you can all roll 20s every time and you will still all die, because the game is just not designed that way. And that is something you should keep in mind, is that Pathfinder does require you to play as a group more often than not. And if you have 4 loose cannons, you will probably have 4 dead loose cannons very quickly.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just the way it's built. On the flip side is that I find that the rewards you get for playing as a group and helping each other out and supporting each other in combat is extraordinary and unbelievably fun, and makes the party turn into a true party dynamic. And you see people, constantly in combat saying, okay, you do this and I'll do this, and then we'll support each other. And then, you cast the spell and I'll haste you. And then you go do this attack and you flank so that the thief gets a sneak attack bonus. And everyone is doing something to help out each other. And it just makes a really, really fun dynamic game. And I'd say that is probably, in my opinion, the biggest difference. If you were going to say what's the difference between 5e and Pathfinder, there's a lot overall. But in terms of that, I've played, and Mark knows that I am the definition of loose cannon. I can play 5e as a loose cannon and go do my own stuff, and we're fine, and there's no consequences, and everyone lives. If I did that and did what you just described, Dave, and start opening up doors and bleeding encounters, everyone will die. It's just that simple. Just the way it's built.
One of the things that you mentioned before was about if you just stand for most of the characters and classes in Pathfinder, if you just stand next to the big bad evil guy, bludgeoning him or her every single turn, you're probably going to get swatted. But one of the things that I saw from my players coming from 5e to Pathfinder is they were doing that because they were terrified of moving away from an enemy, because they had been conditioned that when you do that, you provoke an opportunity attack.
Right.
And so they felt glued to whichever enemy they stepped close to first. A big thing to know if you're a player coming into Pathfinder 2nd edition, attacks of opportunity do exist, but they are not universal. It's not a universal rule. It's something that members of the fighter class get at first level, and other martial classes can decide they want to take as one of their feats, and they're fewer and far between. And what this does is it opens up the entire map for people to freely move about without that fear of provoking those attacks of opportunity. So I think that may be contributing to that issue that you saw, Mark, of people just standing there and just bludgeoning for 3 attacks every turn.
In terms of movement, I think it definitely is. There's a lot of other things you can do other than move. Although I will say, moving is great. And even if your enemy has an attack of opportunity, is one of the rare opponents that does, you can still step.
Mm-hmm.
If you have the same reach as your opponent and you're the only one who's in melee with them, and let's say they are that big boss, like we were talking about, like you were just talking about, Dave. The just spending your third action to step away from the melee enemy means that you've spent one of your 3 actions. If you're a 4-person group, that's one of the 12 actions available to your party. And you've denied the opponent one of their 3 actions. Because if you're no longer in their reach and the only things they can do are to people in their reach. Because that boss is probably has a much better use for that third action, even if it is just attacking you. If they're much higher level than you, they might actually hit with that third attack. So you may have actually denied them a hit, a pretty decent chance for a hit, in exchange for not making an attack that you would have only hit on like a 19 or a 20.
Yeah.
And so even if they have an attack of opportunity, it might still be better to move. And certainly if they don't, you're absolutely right. You can just move anywhere you want. You can do all sorts of shenanigans and use that to your advantage. That's sort of like, there's some monsters where you can well on them, like oozes. Their armor class is terrible. You could just make 3 attacks on them, but they're also really slow. So you still have the interesting question of, well, but I could move away. It might actually take the ooze multiple moves to catch back up to me if I move away, but I probably will hit with the third attack. So it becomes an even different tactical question where you have to decide what's the best option and like, does it seem like it's close to death, and make a lot of decisions.
Yeah, I think we could probably do an entire show just on what can you do with your third action.
Many people have.
Some channels have done that.
A lot of people have done that. And by the way, let's back up for people who are like, what are we talking about? So in Pathfinder, and now we're talking about combat, because when it comes to Pathfinder and 5e, to be honest, the role-playing aspects, they're pretty identical. You know, the roles are a little different, the skills are a little different, but you can probably listen to a game of 5e or Pathfinder, and if they were just doing role-playing, you probably couldn't tell which was which, except by the skill names. So that is really not where the differences are going to come in. The main differences are going to be in combat. And as you know, Pathfinder and 5e, a big part of the game is combat. Maybe even more so in Pathfinder. There is a lot of combat, and it is a main aspect of the game. So with that being said, there is something called the 3-action economy, which means every single monster and every single creature and PC, more or less, has 3 actions. And just about everything requires an action. Sometimes it takes 2, sometimes it takes 3. So you're like, I want to open a door. What does that take? An action. I want to drop prone. What does that take? An action. I want to pull out my sword. That's an action. I want to attack an enemy. That's an action. I want to move. That's an action. Everything's an action. Obviously, spells, many spells are 2 or 3 actions, especially if they're very powerful spells. And some special abilities, like moving and attacking, might be 2 actions. But for all intents and purposes, everything is an action, and you have 3 actions. And a very common thing might be move, attack, attack, or move, attack, and then move away. And that's something you can do in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, is that you don't have to be glued to the monster. You can literally say, hey, wait, does that mean I can literally move 20 feet, attack the monster, and then run away 20 feet, and they have to come to me? And the answer is yes, you can do that. And it's very common. You will run all over the place. There's a lot of fluidity in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, to the point that it's almost shocking when 5th Edition players come over. They're like, everyone's running all over the place. And it's like, yeah, because attacks of opportunity are fairly rare, especially at the lowest levels. They're almost non-existent. Mm-hmm. And when you get to the point that attacks of opportunity are more common, you probably have been playing for a while and you won't have to worry about them. You'll know what to do by then.
Right. So I would say, other than what we've covered here, the last thing I would make sure to remind for a player before we move into some of the GM specific ones, or any other last things you all have for players, is to understand how the degrees of success work. Now, in past editions, in some editions of Dungeons and Dragons, there have already been things where, like, if you succeed this by a certain amount, then it's an even better result. Or like, if you fail, then you didn't disarm the trap, but if you fail by this much, then it goes off in your face. But one thing with Pathfinder second edition that we did is that it's completely codified. If you succeed by 10 or more, then you get a critical success on what you were doing. Also, a 20 gives you one result better than you would expect. So it's usually a critical success, unless, as Steven said, you're going up against a 20th level dragon when you're level 7, then all bets are off. And if you fail by 10 or more, then that is a critical failure. And on that one is always one result worse than you think. So that can often wind up being a critical failure, even if it didn't fail by 10. In some rare cases where you're just such a godlike person, it might not be a critical failure. It might be just a regular failure, but it's still not good to roll a natural 1. So the reason this is pretty important is it means that rather than just a binary yes, no on a lot of rolls, there actually can be up to 4 options. And in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, that's not always true. Like, if you're just attacking with your sword, there's only going to be 3 because the critical failure and the failure of both that you just miss. You don't like drop your weapon or something. That would be awful. And then you miss on a failure or critical failure, you hit on a success, and you crit for double damage on a critical success. With having 4 degrees of success, that means that a lot of times that you were used to something that was like, well, either win the fight with this spell or nothing happens. You're now more in a situation where it's like, okay, if they critically fail against the spell, then I win the fight, maybe, or nearly win it. If they fail, it's very good for us. Even if they succeed, it's pretty useful. Like, it might be something like, the boss succeeded against my slow, so they lose just 1 action. And obviously that's not a lot for a spell. You even spent more actions than that to cast it. But since the boss only had 3 actions to give, that still cut off another one of their actions. Maybe the dwarf fighter that we were talking about all those times stepped away, and that cost another one of the boss's actions, and the boss only has 1 action left to attack you, suddenly is not so threatening anymore. And then on a critical success, only if the enemy rolls a critical success did they just say, ha, your spell did nothing, did 0. So not only does this give you more dynamic possibilities that are kind of less of a, oh, well, it's over, or, oh, I guess it didn't help, but it also means that each bonus or penalty that you apply can be very meaningful. Now, people always underestimate bonuses and penalties. Even in 5e, a +1 or a -1 are actually extremely, extremely good. They're good in any D20 game. And people, just like, we're conditioned to think, oh, 1, that's the smallest number. So it must not be that helpful. Whereas in any game that you may have played, like a computer game or games that use percentile-based statistics, if you saw a thing in a computer game that's like +5% to such and such to your chance to dodge your opponent's attack every time, and it was like an option in, I don't know, Diablo or World of Warcraft, you would be like, wow, +5% each time I raise this to dodge the attack. That's very good. It seems low in D20 games because it's the lowest amount. I'm here to tell you that it's high all the time, and it's very, very valuable in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, because the way that the math works on that +10, -10 means that no matter what your target number is, unless it is literally exactly 11 on the D20 plus your modifier will hit, there's no other number than that where adding a +1 does not also either give you more critical hits on the D20 or remove one of your critical failures from the D20. So what I'm saying here is, like, let's say you needed a 13 to save against the Dragon's Breath. That means on a 3 on the D20 roll, you were going to critically fail and eat double damage from the Dragon's Breath. So a +1 not only means that your 12 will succeed, instead of just a 13, but it means that your 3 will not critically fail. You'll only critically fail on a 2. That cuts down a third of all your critical failures. Similarly, what that means is if you needed a 10 on the D20 to hit the monster with your sword, and you got a +1 to hit, now you need a 9, and a 19 will crit. That means that you gained 1/6 +1/6 to your expected damage, which is vastly more than, like, if you do a quiz show and I hadn't just told you before and I had asked made you think about it first and been like, if I give you +1 on a 1 to 20 roll, what percentage of increased damage do you think you would have if you needed a 10 to hit? You probably would have picked a number that was less than 1/6. Like, that's a whole lot. That means that if you make something flat-footed, which in Pathfinder gives them a -2 to their armor class, and you needed a 10 before that, that's +1/3 to damage. So if you have 3 party members attacking, it's like you have a phantom 4th party member almost, just because you were all flanking. Compared to 4 people who weren't flanking, they'll get about the same result. That's a lot. Most people don't expect that, and it's something to consider. I would say that's my last thing for players specifically.
We got a little lesson there. Mark went really deep into that.
What can I say? I created the I came up with the idea for the degrees of success initially in like a
Really?
concept doc.
So my favorite thing in the game, I have to say that Mark did now. I have to say great.
I'm sorry, Steven.
Oh man.
I mean, everybody eventually accepted it on the design team, and they helped refine it too. Like
it is good.
That was my concept doc initially because of the reasons that we stated.
With that being said, there is something else called a hero point in Pathfinder, which is basically every session, every player gets 1 free reroll of a d20. They only get 1. They can't reroll it again. So if you don't like your second roll, you're too bad. And then the DM or GM can give out more if you do something like tell a good joke or do something heroic or buy dinner, whatever you want. They just can figure it out and give you guys free hero points. And hero points are used. In fact, we just had a discussion a few weeks about this, is that we had a goblin with about 112 hit points, and he got cast on him Finger of Death. He critically failed, which did 140 hit points and killed him instantly. Ooh. As in, goodbye character, goodbye 12th level character, no less. And he's like, well, I'm going to hero point that one. And he went from 140 hit points with a critical failure to a success, which was 35 hit points of damage. And he was fine. So that is a good example of the critical success, critical failure options in action that Mark designed, as well as the hero point, which can save you from certain death. Not only that way, but also the death system. But I don't want to get into that. But the hero points are used also to prevent your character from dying outright and then coming back miraculously from the brink of death. But it is another aspect of the game that you do need to learn that just doesn't exist in 5e in any native form. Are there any other items you can think of, Dave, that's important for Pathfinder?
For players in particular.
Yeah, players.
Anyway, I don't know if I would label it as it's super important, but one of the things that my players have commented on that they really like about Pathfinder is the initiative system. And 5e initiative is tied to dexterity, is whoever can draw their sword fastest wins initiative. Pathfinder, by default, is based on perception. How quickly you realize you're in danger dictates the order you act. But beyond that, the initiative system in Pathfinder is built so that you can use other skills as your initiative. So if you are sneaking and you transition into a combat encounter, you would use your stealth as your initiative. The sneakier you were, the higher you're going to be in that initiative turn. And there's other ways that we've found ways of using acrobatics. If you were swinging on a chandelier as you drop over people to start a fight, well, your acrobatics is now your initiative. So I don't want to take too much time diving into that, but that's something that my players have really appreciated coming from 5e to Pathfinder.
I'm glad that one was another one that I proposed to.
Oh boy.
Yeah, gold star for Mark.
More ego stroking for Mark.
The 3-action economy is most people's favorite. Is absolutely
hands down.
That's Steven,
not something that I proposed.
That's Steven.
I love it, but Stephen Radney McFarlane did most of the work on that, and Jason Bowman will always remind you that he helped Stephen with the initial conception of it. And obviously Logan and I and Jason did a ton of refining on it. Well, it's not even similar to the first version that Stephen came up with, but I would still give Stephen, not this Stephen, but Stephen McFarlane, the vast majority of the credit for the initial conception of the 3 actions.
And that goes back to Pathfinder Unchained in first edition, right?
Yeah, and Steven
Yeah.
wrote that, although Jason
Okay.
will also tell you that he helped Steven write that.
Because I'm always
Um,
going to say that I help Mark now, and
Yeah.
anything done by Roll for
I think
Combat.
Jason did help Steven, but I watched Steven write a lot of it, like in the room that I and he were both in. So I know that he did most of it. So if that's what we're thinking for players, and we can still come back to players if we can think of something while we're talking about GMs, or as we said before, that's like DMs, but for Pathfinder, let's get into talking about things for GMs. So first of all, I want to tell you, potential GMs, and also someone who, if you're here and you're like, I want to be a player, but maybe I could GM, but it's really hard in D&D. I've seen how hard it is. There's lots of judgment calls you have to make. It's really an acquired skill. It's kind of an art. I'm here to tell you that Pathfinder Second Edition is actually easier to GM than D&D. It's not easier to build a character. Like Dave said, there's a lot of options. Building a character is more difficult because there are more choices. It just is not easier to build a character. Therefore, it's not easier for a new player to just go from nothing to having a character that's ready and jump in. It actually is easier for a GM to build their stuff, to use existing content. Either way, it's easier for you. And part of the reason for that is that the building tools that are in Pathfinder Second Edition for encounters and monsters, for example, they're the same tools that Paizo uses to make things. Like Paizo has some like in-house styles that are more for style points. It's like, this will make this monster kind of feel like its numbers breathe a little bit better, but it's not going to change the balance of the monster at all, really, right? So because of that, D&D does not, like Wizards does not use the system that are from the books to make monsters. They have their own secret sauce. And that means that it's going to be easier to build monsters. It just teaches you step by step, top down, come up with your concept. You can build a monster. In fact, you can find me running lots of different streams where we build a monster in a 30-minute to an hour stream. And a lot of that time is just getting chat to vote for the monster. Like if we didn't have chat voting for it, it would take even less time to build one. It's pretty easy. And building encounters is not only simpler, but it is generally, obviously, you can never have a completely scientific encounter builder. Some encounters are going to be harder or easier than you expected, but it's pretty close. And usually if it tells you this encounter is severe, watch out. This is a big fight. It usually is severe. And if it says this is a low threat, there's still some threat to it, but that's pretty low threat. It's probably not going to kill everybody. It's probably low. Whereas in D&D, the CR system is way more of an art than a science, and it does not necessarily predict how hard the encounter is going to be. And so it means that a lot of people have told me that they've run encounters in D&D where they thought it was the big fight and it was actually very easy, even though the CR system said it was deadly or even higher than deadly. And then they ran something that was supposed to be pretty easy, but it wound up being really hard unexpectedly. So you can find that it's easier to build encounters and monsters in Pathfinder, and it's generally easier to adjudicate things because there's a framework that's built in, and there's even a sidebar that's like, hey, your player wants to do something that's not in here or that you haven't seen. Great. It's probably an action. They may have to roll a check for it. Mm-hmm. It may be 2 actions if it feels like something that spamming 3 times per round, it's maybe a little much. And then you're ready to go. Because of the fact that a lot of things are built in a framework that is very kind of modular and very consistent in how they work between each piece of the game, once you learn it as a player or as a GM, once you learn how something works, it works the same way everywhere in the game. And that also makes it easy for a GM to make your own ruling and feel like it's keeping consistent with the system, even if there's a situation that comes up that's not exactly in the game book.
Yeah, I do want to mention that something very different if you're a GM is that in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, all the math, all the tools, everything is transparent. I don't think there's really anything hidden in Pathfinder. Everything that you need to know is in the books. And that makes your job as the GM really easy if you need to figure out things on the fly, because there's tables, there's charts, there's how much gold to give out of various levels, there's how much damage monsters are supposed to do if you want to build a monster on the fly. Everything is in there. This is the polar opposite of 5e, which, as someone who designs 5e, trust me, we have designers here who spend a lot of time figuring out what the bonuses are in 5e because they're purposely hidden, which I won't get into, as that's a whole other topic, but they basically want you in 5e to sort of focus on story and just figure out mechanics on your own, and whatever you figure out is fine. If you start getting really deep into combat, mechanics start mattering, especially if you have life and death situations. I don't know how many times I've seen it where, if a roll was going to mean death for a character, we stop and like really go through everything carefully and make sure all the mechanics are right, because that's bad. Like you want to make sure if a character's death is not earned, then everyone feels shortchanged. And I've seen more than one PC quit the game because of that, which I feel is a big issue with 5e, is that I've seen more than once the character deaths were not necessarily earned, and there was nebulous things around them, like why that monster was doing so much more damage than some other monster. I won't get into that, but in in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, everything's laid out. All the math, it's all out there. You know exactly how things are built. You can do it. You're using the exact same tools that we use as professionals. There is no difference. And that is a breath of fresh air, because suddenly as a GM, you feel like you have the power to run a game accurately and also can come up with things on the fly, and it'll probably be pretty balanced because you know how the rest of the game works. And as Mark said, because you have in combat, everything's an action. Well, they want to do something weird. Okay, it's an action. It's really hard. Okay, it's 2 actions. That's it. You don't really have to worry about it. Okay, I'm doing something really cool. Can I get a bonus? All right, you get a +1. And that's something else actually that is important. There is no advantage and disadvantage in 2nd edition. And one thing as a GM is if your players say, "Hey, could we have advantage and disadvantage in our Pathfinder game?" The answer is no. You should never, ever, ever, ever do it, only because the math is so much tighter. Mark, when you have advantage and disadvantage in your Pathfinder 2nd Edition game, doesn't it give an average of a +4.5 to 5.5 advantage disadvantage, which is, I can't think of anything that, even the highest level weapon you can get is a +3. So
in a D20 system where you just have success and failure, it tends to run typically in the 4 to 4.5 range, but can be worth 5 or more if you're in the right spot on the D20. It can be worth a weird amount. It can also be worth very little if you
But the point is,
we're gonna hit almost no matter what.
Right, but the point is trying to use that in Pathfinder.
In Pathfinder 2nd Edition, because of this critical success and critical failures, it's actually more consistently closer to a 4. And it almost never goes up to a 5. That's not because it's weaker. Mm-hmm. That's because the plus is stronger. Mm-hmm. And the advantage is stronger, but the plus is more stronger, if you see what I mean. So it almost never goes up to a 5 because the value of the 4 is, well, if you needed a 10 to hit, a +4 gives you plus 2/3 to your damage. Right? If it was +5, it'd be close to doubling yourself. So it never goes quite that high, I believe, but it's also more consistently in the high range of the 4 to 4+, whereas there are some numbers where it can be lower in D&D. If you only needed a 3 to hit, obviously it's worse than a +1 to have advantage, because a natural 1 still fails in D&D. So it's still worse than needing a 2 to hit, which is a guaranteed the best you can get in well, actually, I guess that's not necessarily true. So it's better than that. It's slightly better than a +1 because you need 2. you would need to roll 2 3s or below, and that's less likely than rolling 1 natural 1.
For anyone who wanted to see game design in action, you're seeing it right now as Mark is figuring it out.
Slightly better than a +1 if you needed a 3 to hit. Whereas if you need a 3 to hit in Pathfinder 2nd edition, it's actually still worth a lot to have a plus or to have a reroll, because you need a 13 to crit, right? So your reroll is increasing your chances of a crit by a lot. Yeah. So
long story short is I would not put in advantage and disadvantage ever in Pathfinder. It just doesn't work, and it doesn't work on either end. It's as Mark can get into the math, trust me, the math will destroy you if you try to use it.
There are effects that let you reroll. There are fortune and misfortune
effects. Yes, but that's reroll.
They're generally budgeted as being pretty powerful.
And they're also rerolls, as in you don't roll twice and take the better.
I mean, sometimes you do.
Sometimes, okay, true. But
they can be either one.
It's often, though, you roll and then you take your second roll, which could be worse.
It could be worse. That is usually better for you to roll, then decide to use it, and then re-roll again. It's actually usually better than being like, I'm going to do a thing now, so I'm going to roll twice.
So if you have a character who says, I want advantage, disadvantage, fine. There's many feats and abilities in the game that allow you to do that. And that's what I would do. I would say,
play an unexpected sharpshooter. They're all about doing some weird thing, like in Trigun with Vash the Stampede, where they're, oh, look, I saw a butterfly. And then the enemy gets essentially like a disadvantage against attacking them. Or they make a shot and then they somehow manage to hit, even though it looked like they were doing something weird due to a ricochet, and then they get essentially advantage on it. So there are options that will get you in that direction.
What about you, Dave? We haven't heard from you in a while. They want to hog the whole spotlight here.
Yeah, I am not a mathlete. I cannot give you the statistical breakdown of advantage and disadvantage, but absolutely not. That would break the game. Yes. Yes, it would break the game. No, I would not allow it.
Yeah. Something else as a GM I would note is that as a rule, not always, monsters are much faster than player characters, to the chagrin of my players. They hate it. And, often characters will have a 25 speed, maybe a 30, especially at the lowest levels. Monsters will often start off with a 30, 35, 40 speed, which means they can run all over the battlefield. And if you want to get people really engaged in combat and show them that, hey, you don't need to just stand there, have the monsters move around. I do it all the time. I have my monsters constantly moving. And not only does it make people engaged in combat and thinking about what to do, they realize, wait, we can move? Like, you don't have to just stand there and attack endlessly until the monster's dead. And because the PCs don't have attack of opportunity usually, just do it. Just have the monsters move around. You don't need the monsters to attack 3 times. Have the monsters attack someone, then run to the back and attack someone in the back. Then everyone's like, and then they have to start running around. They realize, I have to stay far behind if I'm going to be attacking from range, and, mix it up. You can mix up the battlefield quite a bit. And that's probably your best tool as a GM, is just have the battles dynamic and have them fun. Don't turn them into slogfests.
That changes the meta for your group. It's not unbeatable. In fact, if your enemy is moving faster than you, and it's always going to end its turn, and this moving away from you, consider pulling out a ranged attack. At that point, you can make as many ranged attacks as you want. Your enemy is still going to have to move in, attack you, and move out. So you've limited them to 1 attack per round, as long as you don't spend your actions chasing after them at a 2-for-1 trade-off. Instead, you can just make things more annoying for them. Or let's say they're 40 and you're 25, like Steven said, right? So they moved 40 feet away. If they were a little smarter, maybe they would have moved only 30 or 35 so that you couldn't get it, but they were closer. They moved 40 feet away. Okay, I will shoot you, and then I'll move 15 feet back from you. Or if they move 40 feet, even just 10 feet back, it's like, oh no, it looks like you need to take 2 actions to get to me if you want to attack me in melee. If you do that, you won't have an action left to run away. Now you're next to me. So positioning can become very strategic, and it's not necessarily the case that the enemy is being faster means, well, now the PCs lose. That's how the slower person can turn the tables for their own advantage.
Yeah, and I highly recommend, if you go on YouTube and do a search for 9 things to consider when building an encounter, you'll find an excellent video on the How It's Played YouTube channel that goes into how to make your encounters more dynamic with a lot of things you've been hearing here from Stephen and Mark. So a shameless plug.
Well, that's something else, is that half of the game, I would say, at least my games, are encounters. You know, there are fights. It's a big part of the game. And one of the nice things about Pathfinder is that the encounters are really dynamic, is that I've had, no fight ever really goes exactly the same. Yes, PCs can get into routines where they're constantly, doing sort of the same types of actions, but not the same way every time. Maybe they go into mountain stance if they're a monk, then maybe they run up and do like a 2-inch punch or something. But if they're fighting something that's flying, suddenly they got to change their whole tactics. If they're fighting something that's very quick and running all over the place, and they just can't catch up, then they have to change their tactics, or maybe they have to start tripping the monster or start throwing them. They have to do things to incapacitate the monster. And that's one of the big advantages I find when it comes down to it, is that the monsters, in my opinion, are much better, more dynamic, and do a lot more in Pathfinder 2nd Edition than you pretty much ever see, unless you're using third-party materials, in 5e. And as a GM, it makes your life not just easier and more fun, but it also gives you more opportunities, because now you're not just, I run in, I attack, okay, it's your turn. It's like, ooh, I got these cool new abilities. Ooh, what's this trample do? Let me try trample. Ooh, swallow whole. Try swallow whole. Or, a lot of these monsters have special abilities that are only for that monster and nothing else. And yeah, your monsters are going to die. So cool, you get to try out that cool special ability. Everyone's like wowed and worried, and the PCs are like, uh-oh, I don't want to see them do that again. And then they kill the monster, and everyone wins. The PCs had a really cool encounter. They got to see something new. You got to try out something new. And it's fun. And then you do that the next time and the next time. And then you get people hooked, because it's like, wow, these monsters are really cool. They do weird things every time we see them. It's never the same attack twice. And we actually have to think through our encounters and work together as a team. And oh my God, I'm hooked on Pathfinder. What just happened?
Yeah, I mean, I don't see a as broad of a difference from 5e to Pathfinder as you have laid out there. Except for the attack of opportunity issue that we've already talked about. Just that simply removing that as being universal does miracles for making your encounters more dynamic in people and enemies moving around the map, which also means you can now make maps that have pits and other terrain elements that when I ran in 5e were never utilized, because again, because of attacks of opportunity, people get stuck standing still. Now you can use that environment in ways that that I didn't when I was running 5e.
Yeah, and I think, Dave, what Steven is getting at is 5e absolutely can have monsters with lots of interesting abilities that do that. In fact, when he was kind of alluding to this, so I'll just say it directly. When our 5e converters converted the Pathfinder 2nd Edition monsters from Battle Blue Bestiary into 5e, they made monsters that some of the people who were independently reviewing it said were some of the best monsters they'd seen put out for 5e, because they had a lot of interesting abilities. But the real secret to that, it wasn't even like, oh, well, it wasn't about who's more talented of a designer. Weirdly, you might think, is it about talented design? Is it about game system and what encourages what? No, Steven figured out it was about art choices. The layout that is made for monsters in 5e, the default layout, doesn't really give you very much space to put in certain special abilities if you use that layout with those boxes. And so monsters, in order to fit, had to be constrained. And so when he changed the layout for same system, it's still 5e, But he just changed the layout to give it more space to have special abilities, and suddenly our converters were able to put in lots of cool special abilities too. So you absolutely can do it in 5e, but you won't find them in as many of the out of the tin monsters you buy for 5e because of the way the layout is.
Very interesting.
Yes. Yeah. In fact,
I would never have expected that was why.
Yeah. So one thing is actually the Monsters of the Multiverse. They've actually gone through. I saw that someone was paying attention because they have reduced the number of actions headers. And by reducing the number of headers in the monster stat blocks, it adds like another 2 to 4 to 6 lines, which is another, 2, 3, or, 1 to 2 or 3 encounters, abilities for your monsters. It also, even believe it or not, has to do, and this sounds crazy, but the stat block of how the strength, intelligence, dexterity, all the core abilities are in this block. And if you look at even the Paizo stuff, it's that you can't put a monster art into that block because then it breaks it and then it can't wrap. So when I was doing initial layout, I tried that, and then I realized I literally can't put monsters and flow them into the text. So I broke that too. I just put everything the same way Pathfinder does a layout where everything is just individual lines. And because they don't use blocks or block text, they can put graphics and text in any format they want. It makes for a much more fluid design. It also makes you allow to fit more content inside the design. I basically said, I'm not using 5e layouts. I'm using Pathfinder layouts for all my 5e material. And it gets us several hundred more words for our monsters. And I'm actually starting to see, maybe it's a coincidence. Maybe I'm starting something out. Maybe my dog won't stop barking. But I'm seeing other third-party manufacturers doing it too. And they're starting to lay out their monsters very similar to the way I do it. And I think they're realizing, holy crap, you're right. You don't have to make these block texts and these square monster blocks that you see in 5e.
You never know, but I think it's probably a coincidence.
I think it's a little bit of both.
From my experience as a RPG designer who has had people tell me about another RPG that I wasn't paying attention to and been like, wow, you must have copied this off of such and such a thing. I was like, oh, no, I didn't know they did it like that. That's cool. When designers are trying to solve a problem, and this is in layout design or in game design, there's a lot of convergence. If you have a good designer who's trying to solve the same problem, you might see solutions that have similarities. Yeah. It doesn't mean that there wasn't a connection. It just means that there's a very plausible explanation that there wasn't. Yeah. And so it's pretty likely that it just kind of happened. And honestly, I would take that as a compliment of your skill, that it was that you did it first, and then even if someone independently realized that was a good solution, it shows how skilled you are there.
Yeah, believe it or not, and this is going to be a weird thing to say, but although the 5e books are beautiful, and I think they use gorgeous layouts, and they do things there that I've just never even seen, they use a lot of regimented layout materials, for example, monster blocks, and it does limit some of the gameplay mechanics, believe it or not. It's I could do a whole course on this, but design equals function. And in fact, I used to teach this actually in college level courses on this. Anyhow, design does follow function, and because of some of the design choices they made, it does limit, like, for example, monster stat blocks. Why am I saying this? Because Paizo designs for their books are very good. On a scale of 1 to 10, I give them a 9, occasionally a 10. They are about as good as they get. And the reason is they've been doing this a very long time. They fine-tuned it over the years. If you look at some of the Paizo books from 10 years ago, you can actually see it for your designer, how they've been constantly iterating on them, making them better and better and better. And the latest, greatest Pathfinder 2nd Edition books are superb. And they still even iterate on them. Like Monster Manual 1, the first monster book, Bestiary for Pathfinder. The third one is a little better. Third one, they figured out a few things and they redid the layout a little. And that allows the game to breathe more, and it allows the game to have better design choices, which means better gameplay choices for you as the GM.
So I want to move on to
Right.
to more tips for GMs coming in from 5e.
Okay.
Although
Yeah,
the
yeah.
layout thing actually could be its own
Well, it is its
episode.
own tip, but you do your math. I'm doing layout. We'll get Dave.
Yeah,
He'll do
absolutely.
his thing.
So I have another one that I want to hear from both of you about too. So, but I'll introduce it, which is one thing you're moving into GMing that you might not be used to. That's another part of what makes it easier to GM, is that in 5e, it kind of, the system assumes that you're not giving out necessarily any magic items, but they know that you really are going to give them out, and then you kind of have to figure it out. There are some random tables, you can use those. They're going to be a little bit random about what you get. With Pathfinder Second Edition, there is a detailed level by level table that gives you a rough average of what you might expect to drop of treasure for that entire level in terms of total value. And then in terms of, well, what's a reasonable number of like permanent items and consumables and like gems and gold to give at that level for a group of 4? What if you add a player, subtract a player, and put in more or fewer characters? So you've got a table that's at your fingertips that is going to help you figure things out, that makes it easier to do something like what I did for Roll for Combat, where we turn it all into crafting using monster parts into new items, because it can be reverse engineered off of that table. That also means that items, instead of using rarity to determine how powerful they are, rarity just tells you how hard it is to find the item, and the level of the item tells you how powerful it is in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. If it's level 12, it's a pretty reasonable item for a 12th level character. They've got price ranges for each level, and it'll tell you what exact price that item is, but you can even see the entire price range in the building items section of the Game Mastery Guide. So what that means is, pretty consistently, it's like, okay, this is a 12th level item. If I give it at level 2, you know what? It may throw off the balance of the game because I gave a level 12 item at level 2. If I give it at level 10, it's good. It's even slightly higher than the expected levels. You usually find ones that are like one level above you or at your level, but it's probably not going to break things too much. It'll just be something that people are, ooh, level 12 item, you say. So by virtue of having that level there, it kind of makes it much easier to pick your treasure and to assign treasure confidently, and knowing that you're going to be doing something that was within the system's expectation.
Yeah, magic items in general was one of the things in 5e that gave me headaches, because players, we were coming from 3rd edition D&D and some from 4th edition, where we were used to there being very clearly spelled out, this magic item is worth this amount of money and you can buy it and sell it. And one of the things that my players really latch onto is they enjoy receiving magic items. Magic items are fun. We want them. But in 5e, the roadblock we were encountering was, by raw, it's incredibly difficult to buy or sell a magic item. And my recollection is when it did come time for them to buy a magic items, like I created a system where basically the church was running the economy, and so you could go to temples to try to buy or sell magic items. But if it was a rare magic item, there was, like, if I remember right, there was one blanket price that was given for all of the magic items.
It went up by times 10 when you went up a category.
Okay.
That's right. So it would go like 5,000, then 50,000, then 500,000.
Right. But within that realm of a rare magic item at that level, there seemed to very clearly be some that were weaker than others. So why are they all priced at the same time? Anyway,
some of them were strictly weaker. You could have 2 rare giant belts, one of which was just a better giant belt than the other one. So clearly they have some hierarchy, right, Dave?
my recollection was I had all kinds of problems with it. That's the bottom line. And we played the game to 15th level, and I gave more magic items and allowed them to trade more magic items than I think the game intended. But I did that because for my players, that's fun. And at the end of the day, we want to have fun. And then at the end of the campaign, they got to the big bad evil guy. I was running the Tiamat campaign, the 2-book, and they barely beat the encounter in the 3rd round. But me being the GM or DM that I was, I stretched it out because I wanted to have a satisfying end to the campaign. But long story short, I'm rambling. But to answer your question, I believe from a GM perspective, magic items, both awarding them, placing them into encounters, buying them, selling them, using them, is all much better balanced in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. So hopefully DMs who are converting to GMs will find the same experience.
Yeah, I mean, everything's better in Pathfinder 2nd Edition in terms of the numbering system, in terms of the balance of numbering
it depends
system.
on your preference.
It depends on your preference.
I wouldn't say that, Steve.
Yeah, well, I would say that in the sense that let me caveat that. It's better in the sense that if you want to see the rules and you want to have magic items and items, there is very specific rules on
Yes.
what level these items are, whether they're uncommon, whether they're rare, what the pricing structure is, and so forth. That works really easily.
So you mean for
Absolutely.
magic items and for being explicit?
Yes,
that
explicitly
is more explicit and
yes.
more clear.
Yes, it's very clear. There's no nebulous math. And the math they used, this again, I won't get into the details. The math they used for 5e is the exponent math, where everything goes up by 10. It breaks really quickly and really easily. I'm not sure why they did that. I guess they didn't have a statistician who helped out with that, because you don't do that. The way you do it is the gradual curve method, which is what what Pathfinder 2nd Edition does, which is, yes, they get more expensive, but more gradually. You don't make one thing, you don't make a level 4 item 10 times more expensive than a level 1 item, and make a level 7 item 10 times more expensive than a level 4 item, and so forth.
I don't think they wanted to be trading magic items.
That's something else. They didn't even want it in the game, I think. I think by them leaving it out, it's almost like, don't worry about it. You're just telling stories. You just make up whatever you want.
I don't want to put words in their mouths, but my impression was they didn't want the game to be about gear. They wanted it to be about the characters,
right?
Not so much the gear.
Correct.
But in my game, I have players who love their magic gear.
But that is actually,
your players aren't abnormal.
Yeah,
that's actually a fault, I think, of development, because in Pathfinder and D&D and even video games, gear is your character. It's a major aspect and an extension of your character. That's not real life. And it might not even be in traditional storytelling, but is a Jedi without a lightsaber? You tell me.
100% yes.
Exactly.
They still are, but
I got the lightsabers to prove it.
Right, but the point is like, it's an iconic aspect, and if you are playing these games, you expect to have magic weapons, you expect to have magic armor, you expect to have potions and scrolls and all of these items.
Right. It's part of the fantasy.
Right.
So there are a contingent of people. There are, and to be frank, in some ways, I can see the appeal. There are contingent of people who don't want to have all of these. Like, there's an item that gives me +2 with sword hitting. It's a +2 sword, and they rather their bonuses come from their own inherent power. Mm-hmm. And even to that degree, I can see that. I still want magic items, but I'm okay if they only did cool things and they didn't add math numbers. I think that the people who want there to be fewer items are actually overrepresented among game designers compared to the population as a whole, though. Correct. So like when some of us at Paizo were thinking, like Logan and I were like, well, what if we took all of the pluses out of the items, right? What if we made it so they only did something cool, like being on fire with flaming or like special abilities? And we asked it on the survey because some of the fans asked us to. They like automatic progression, which is a variant I first created in Pathfinder Unchained and then put into the Game Mastery Guide for Pathfinder Second Edition, which is where you get all the bonuses yourself inherently and not in your items. And they said, please do this. So we put it in the survey. And sure enough, as I've mentioned before, when I was at Paizo, huge percentages of people said, no, please don't do that.
Yeah.
Because a common complaint was during the playtest, we had up to +5 weapons and armor. And they said, no, this is too much, though. 5 is too much. The difference between not having it and having it at higher levels is just a galaxy away. And it's just too much of a scale. So could you make it less of a number, but do keep it, please, was the thing that got chosen. Also, some people liked it at 5. When you added the people who liked it at 5 and the people who said keep it but lower the amount, and we did, we lowered it down to 3, it was a vast majority. There were very few people who were like, no, yeah, get rid of these. That's just even getting rid of the pluses and keeping the magic items. So Dave, Steven, I completely agree with you. And as a game designer who's been in these discussions, I think overrepresented among game designers who like elegant design are the people who say, well, what if we could remove this? And among the populace of players, like a huge majority want to see that. It's like, yes, this is what it's about. I wanted to find that magic sword.
Yeah, I mean, gear is, I think we beaten this horse to death. Gear is a major aspect of playing these games. And one nice advantage of Pathfinder 2nd Edition is there's a lot of gear. There's more gear than you'll ever need. And it's very easy to implement. It's very easy to utilize. The rules are very clear. It's very easy to price. And if you even want to invent your own magic items, there's even guidelines for that.
Yep.
You can use the automatic progression table. That is actually probably the single greatest table in the book. Mark, who wrote that, is because it tells you exactly what you should be getting at each level. So at level 2, I believe, is where you get a +1 to your weapon. So you can give someone a +1 weapon at level 1 or level 2. That's what's expected. But a +2 weapon doesn't show up until 10. I'm doing it off the top of my head. Hey, correct. New subscriber. So hey, I probably, if I want to make my own weapon, giving them +2 weapon at level 7, if I really wanted to, I could. Definitely early. But if I want them to feel really powerful, I could. Level 5, way too early. Way too early. You can just use that table. You see, you can. Don't get me wrong. But
they might sell it for half because at that point they could buy like a whole bunch of level appropriate items.
Yeah, and don't be surprised, especially, and that's something else. If you've been only playing 5e, don't be surprised when you give all this great loot to your players, and they're like, "This is great, sell it all," because then they go buy what they really want. And I often do that. In fact, one thing I've been doing in some of my more recent games in the Agents of Edgewatch, I just give them gold. I don't even give them equipment, except once in a while. And I'm just like, here, just get whatever you want. It just cuts out the selling part, and then they get exactly what they want. And it ends up being the same. But that automatic progression chart shows you exactly what you're, quote, expected to have at every level, whether it's a plus to your armor or your weapon or your skills and what type of plus it is. And you can just use that chart. Or you could just use the automatic progression system, which does it for you. And then all your weapons and armor and gear just automatically go up.
And kind of similar to that, it's worth noting that the magic items, especially the weapons and armor in Pathfinder, are customizable, which is not something that I'm accustomed to seeing in 5e unless there's been a new book that I'm not aware of. So in Pathfinder, they use a rune system. So a player can customize their gear similar to the way that they can customize their character when they go up and choose a bunch of different feats. Well, you have your sword, and you can say, I want to put a lightning rune on it, and now this sword is a shocking long sword. And this is a story I've told a million times because it really stuck with me. When I was younger, I was playing D&D, and my character had inherited a sword from his father, and he was wanting to be a paladin, and it was a +1 sword. And we reached a point in the campaign where everybody else was using +2 weapons. And everybody in my party got mad at me because I refused to give up that +1 sword because it meant so much to my character. Because in that system, you couldn't upgrade your gear. You had to say, I'm throwing away this sword and now I've got a different sword. Pathfinder, you could say, well, I could take my father's family blade and just put another rune on it that's upgrading it now to being a +2. And so I could keep my gear with me throughout my career. That maybe is not something particular to the conversation about GMs, but it's worth knowing out there for
it's players. Also important because you can move runes from weapons, from one weapon to another. But let's take the super chats. Do you want to take this one more?
Sure. It's from Gina B, who created those parrot people you see to the left of Dave on the screen. Gina B says, some games I love 1 or 2 powerful items to define a character rather than a dozen random things I feel like it must have just to function. That's true. And there's to put that together with what Dave was saying, there's also options to have special items like relics in Pathfinder 2nd edition that are kind of like this item that scales along with you as you're going on. It could be your paladin's father's sword, and it could gain like mysterious special ability as you've been leveling up. So there's a lot to say about that for treasure. Do either of you have an additional topic for GMs? I'm getting towards the end of the ones that I have as well.
I do think we should probably wrap it up, and we could always do a second one of these videos, more advanced items where we could talk about more advanced topics, especially higher level play and what the differences are if people are interested in that. Because I do know some people who play 5e really only at the highest levels. They like to play 15, 20 level characters, believe it or not. One thing I will say is you should probably allow your characters to get the free archetype feat at first level for new players. Do you want to talk about this, either of you? It's basically.
I probably disagree with you.
You disagree. Mark wrote the system.
I think that if you're new, you should not do that because of the reason Dave said, which is that it can be overwhelming in terms of how many options there are. And when you give someone a free archetype feat, especially if you're breaking the free archetype rules and giving it to them at first level, you're introducing a variant. B, it's a popular one. Don't get me wrong.
It's very popular.
I put it in because I wanted that to be a variant. But you're introducing a variant. You're introducing a variant on the variant, and you're telling them, "Hey, pick one of these AT archetypes that each have multiple feats." That vastly makes it harder to make a first level character. There's a reason archetypes don't come in at first level, and that's why. Well, I'll disagree with you.
You disagree, but let me just. I'm just going to do a devil's advocate, so we go both ways. As you, since you designed the game, I can see why you're like it's perfect as it is. But
that's not what I'm saying.
I know. But I will say that Pathfinder can be very hard at first level, especially if you're coming from D&D, and especially if you aren't playing as a group, and you can die quickly. One of the advantages of giving people free archetypes is that they are more powerful at first level and they get more options. Now I can see the flip side is that exactly what I just said. There are more options, it's more complex. But can you think of a other way other than just being a good GM to make
there is an easy way to do this. If you are converting your new group, and you're like, hey, we're new. We think this is gonna be a little harder. Let's say you're writing the material yourself. Don't use severe encounters, even though that says that's gonna be the boss. Use encounters that are only up to moderate. And then even use trivial, low, and moderate encounters instead of low, moderate, and severe. The flip side is in a published adventure, You can run things that let your PCs be a level higher, even though I said to start at level 1. If you don't want to write your own stuff, and you definitely are going to use the published content, just have them come in at level 2 then and facing level 1. That is essentially a sleight of hand way to do what I said, where you never throw severe encounters, because the severe ones become moderate for characters 1 level higher. Essentially give them a whole level. That's actually a more consistent and bigger power boost of free archetype. So to explain for all of you watching this, what free archetype is a variant rule that lets you add an archetype to your character, which eventually basically gives you a whole load of additional feats over the course of your character's level. It's sort of intended to let you express your character more and be a little bit more like of getting your backstory and your personality into the character. One reason I wouldn't recommend it as a means to power boost is it isn't consistently a huge power boost. It can be for certain builds if you're making your character and you pick like, oh yes, getting an animal companion, that might be super strong for me at this level. But for some characters, it's more of a versatility expansion, and it might not be enough to actually help solve the problem that Steven was talking about. So I would recommend giving a free extra level to start off with, or making the encounters a little easier before you go in and throw the severes that the system says are the hardest ones that you would normally throw. Just take them off the table for your starting group, and that's a good way. Throw some trivials.
Yeah, like one thing you'll notice if you buy any pre-made adventures, anything made by professional adventure writers usually has level 1 or level 2, usually either has trivial encounters or a lot of social encounters, so that you get past the squishy levels, level 1 and 2 or so, without high chance of death. And they do that, as I just said, either like lesser encounters with easier combatants, or social encounters, because you can level up just by talking to people in Pathfinder, no problem. And you'll often see that in some of the more professional.
It depends on who your writer is.
Well, I was about to say, if you have Jason Bowman, in fact,
benevolent like Jason, isn't that like his thing? If he's a benevolent GM,
yeah, I'd be very careful with his
death encounters at you, because he's known for being the Dark Souls of adventure writers. Really.
Yeah. The other thing you can do,
I like a challenge, but I'm not always sure that's best for like someone who's brand new. I wouldn't run them through. He was my boss for a while. He writes adventures that I find extremely fun, and some of the most fun ones for me when I want to challenge. But I don't think I would subject new players to his stuff.
His adventures are very hard. But one thing I will say is that there is a tool in Pathfinder where you can turn any creature either weaker or stronger. And if you go online, there's a lot of places that have the monsters, and you literally just push a button and just say weak, and it weakens them. Or you say strong, and it makes them stronger. Basically decreases them or increases them a level. If you want to make your encounters weaker, or if you feel like these, like, oh, I want to have this, monster fight the characters, make them weak. And you can do it right on the fly. You literally just push a button and it's suddenly weak.
Or just give -2.
Or -2 to everything.
The button. That's what it is.
Yep.
That would have been my second choice from starting the PC's second level. If you have to use a pre-published, is weak. Weak is a little bit. It's a little bit more work for you, because you have to give a -2, and it's not as consistently applied. But it is a very solid way to do it.
It works pretty well. I mean, because the math is so tight.
Right. And it's like, hey, your team isn't doing any teamwork. They're not making the monster flat-footed because they're just goofing around. Well, they didn't get a -2, but guess what? You gave the monster a -2, so it all works out.
Do you have any final tips and tricks, Dave? Or
well, I guess one big tip, we've said several times that there are online tools for this and that. I don't think we've ever mentioned by name PF Easy tools. I would, if anybody new is coming in, whether they're playing or GMing, PF Easy tools, I think it's pf2.easytools.es.
Yes.
It's a great resource to find all the rules, all your character classes, all of the monsters. It's got a monster builder if you want to make a monster. I believe it has the option you were just speaking, Steven, about being able to take a monster and apply elite or weak or whatever to balance it. Encounter builder, that is definitely a resource that I would have bookmarked for anybody new coming in. And the other thing I would say, anytime we talk about comparing two systems, something I always want to point out is if you are with fun people, you are going to have a fun time. If you are with lame people, you're going to have an awful time. So I wouldn't get hung up too much on 5e or Pathfinder. If you're with a group of friends that you know and you enjoy the company of them, you're going to have a good time in Pathfinder, just like you did in 5e. So, long story short, just dive in to Pathfinder 2nd Edition and enjoy it. Have fun. And like Mark said earlier, don't worry if a mistake is made. Don't worry if you didn't give a +1 bonus here or there. Just have fun. And if you really want to learn about making sure you get these +1s and these +2s right, you want to make sure you go to How It's Played YouTube channel.
Yeah.
Here I am. I'm plugging away.
Your channel, before I had Mark at my disposal, I lived on your channel because you go through every topic, a lot of edge cases, and go through and explain exactly how flanking works, initiative works. Like, now you got the hang of it. You want to know the basics. You can just sit there at your channel all day watching, and you have basically courses with very detailed pictures and instructions, very clearly laid out. None of the videos are more than usually 10 minutes, so it's done quickly and efficiently. And yeah, your channel's fantastic. And
so we have a pretty super chat.
Yeah, super duper chat.
It is from Cheese of Ages. It's a shout out to the Pathfinder 2e Reddit and the Pathfinder 2e community. A YouTuber new to the game who had tens of thousands of viewers, I think, but was a 5e YouTuber, came in there with a video on 2nd edition talking about having played Pathfinder 1st edition and kind of bouncing off the playtest, and then they came back and what they thought about various aspects of the game compared to things they liked or didn't like about 5e. And it was so well embraced that it was his most successful video in a year in under 8 hours. So Cheese of Ages says the community is so passionate.
Yeah, I mean, the Pathfinder people, I can't say why, they're very passionate. It's a combination that I think Paizo embraces their players very personally. They try to give out materials and create materials that players want. So it's not like you're shouting into an echo chamber. Paizo at least appears to be very, responsive to their players. People like ourselves who do third-party products, we listen to people. We literally have our products help designed by players. Our Battles of Bestiary, all the monsters were created by players. They were all done by people who just submitted monsters. When we came out with the Dragon Ancestry that Mark wrote, we had it heavily play tested by players who came up with a lot of great ideas, and we added it right into the game. And that's something you will find, at least with Pathfinder, is that if you want to have your voice heard and you want to contribute to the community and the game, you usually can, which is pretty rare outside of your own home game. I mean, how rare is it that you can actually help make decisions on actual final products and have your voice heard? Well, you can with Pathfinder. And that is a, big reason why I think I play it. Yes, the game I think is a lot of fun and it has infinite possibilities. I've been playing it twice a week nonstop for 3 years. Still haven't gotten bored, and I still haven't seen even 1% of everything. I feel like I'm playing Elden Ring. It just keeps on going. Never ends. And that's
all
amazing.
Those reasons are true.
Yeah.
About why the community is so passionate. And I think there's also another macro issue, which is whenever there's the big name brand that everybody knows, like Kleenex or D&D or something like that, they even use to main the entire genre of things. If you have something that's like a strong second place or something that's in there and has its strengths, you're going to see that they might have a pretty passionate community that is ready to tell you about what those strengths are, just from the nature of how that is. But I would say even with the factor I mentioned and all the ones you mentioned, Stephen, that can't completely explain for everything about the community. It's just a special community in some senses as well.
And you too can join it. There's no entry fee. You don't even have to buy the book. It's all free.
Paizo would like if you did.
Although, yeah, you probably should buy the book. Probably should buy the book.
The designers, developers, editors, our team, and everybody else at Paizo who works on that, down to customer service, the warehouse, and beyond. But you don't have to. If you just want to play, it's on the Archives of Nethys and many other places, like Dave said.
PF2 Easy. That's actually what I use. I personally use PF2 Easy over Archives of Nethys.
I do too.
Yeah.
I find it easier to use Archives of Nethys because of the fact that Google Archives of Nethys. So Archive of Nethys' own search is not the easiest for me, but if I type Nethys 2E and then anything that I want into Google, I will get exactly what I was looking for immediately as the top hit, like every time. Whereas PF2 Easy, you do have to use their own search tool, which is a good search tool and generally is fairly responsive, but I can't just get it directly from my browser.
I will say one thing I do is, and since it's all free, is that I will often just bring up the monsters ahead of time in tabs, and then I have them ready to go because I play online, and this way I have them. They're ready to go. All the abilities are there. You can click if you want to see what does Enfeeble do again, or what does this poison do, and it's all hyperlinked. It all has tooltips, so you can just roll over and see what everything is. And if you want to make it stronger or weaker, you can press a button, and it's really easy to use. And
conditions.
It's free.
You reminded me of one very quick thing, Steven.
Last thing, conditions.
Okay, last thing. And it's not mostly about conditions. It's just if you want something that has all the conditions, that has all the stuff that you generally need, or even you want to build like monsters on the fly and you'd like to have the monster numbers just right in front of you, the GM screen and the advanced GM screen for Pathfinder 2nd Edition, as a person who's not a GM screen person myself normally, and I'm usually like, what's on here is not useful to me, I don't see the need. The Pathfinder ones, Logan curated really good content onto them, and I find them to be worth your time for a new GM in terms of just like, oh wow, if I'm a basic new GM, the regular GM screen is exactly what I look up most of the time. And if I'm advanced and I build monsters on the fly, the advanced one does. So
are you saying you played advanced Pathfinder and you won?
I would say that's not what I'm saying, but if I need to have been saying that, Stephen, then sure.
It's a community joke. Mark doesn't watch TV. He doesn't.
I thought that they said it was like it was advanced.
Okay, this is your homework, Mark. Go to Amazon. I believe it's on Amazon.
I saw that episode. It's the one where Chevy Chase bullies
Advanced Dungeons and Dragons.
Bullies a kid
Advanced Dungeons and Dragons
for his weight, and there's blackface. So I'm not sure it aged very well.
Oh, that one, yeah, that's the one thing that kind of, I don't know why they included that. That was like him being a drow. That was weird.
Right.
But the rest of it is fine. The rest of it is very interesting.
Fair enough.
Anyhow, so 2 hours. I think we've done enough. We can do many more of these. And where can we find you, Dave?
On YouTube, the channel is How It's Played. I'm also on Twitter, and the handle is how_it's_played_ an extra underscore after played, because Twitter. Check me out. I'm always welcome to enjoy seeing new faces and new comments.
And you can find us. We're at Roll for Combat. Roll for Combat everything. Roll for Combat Twitter, Roll for Combat YouTube, you name it. We're on Roll for Combat.
I also have a stream called Arcane Mark.
That's true.
That is on both Twitch and on YouTube. And later tonight, if you're watching this live, in about 6 hours, we're going to be looking at some monsters from Book of the Dead.
Ooh, Book of the Dead. Where you two can play a skeleton.
Or a ghost.
Or a ghost. Or a vampire. Or a wraith.
Or you could have
or a
ghost
mummy.
Puppy. You could have a ghost puppy.
You could have a ghost puppy.
Mm-hmm.
That's right. Everyone loves that picture. It's that you can have your pet
friend.
Yeah, old friend. You could have a little dog following you around forever and ever. You can do that if you get the Battlesby Bestiary too. You get the Hearthhound who will follow you into death. That's right.
Oh, Giant B asked a good question. Where can they find us this weekend? At PaizoCon.
That's
like
right.
Steven said before, if you will be at PaizoCon, first of all, that's very impressive if you're someone who is playing D&D and is thinking about playing Pathfinder, given how limited the tickets were this year. I am just going to say I'm very surprised by this.
PaizoCon is awesome. Whether
it's
you
an
play,
amazing convention.
whether you play
it's
D&D
so
or
fun.
anything.
It's just that they were limited to 500 tickets, many of which went to rollover tickets from the one that was canceled. So in order to have gotten one as someone who's just thinking about playing Pathfinder, I am very impressed.
If you show up, I can get you a ticket.
But we'll be there at PaizoCon, and we'll be giving some really cool streams. I'm gonna be running an adventure.
Yes, I know nothing about it.
With a dragon and one of those parrot people, and
I'm gonna play the
Gamayan
from here. I figured it out.
So you're gonna be the
I call the Gamayan.
Okay, and Linda is the Leshy.
She's the Leshy. So we have the Indigo Dragon and the Gatsugori. There's the two that are left.
And it's the Sprite Sorcerer and the Indigo Dragon Cleric. So it should be a lot of fun.
I can call it now because Vanessa always plays fighters. So she'll take the... Oh, no, she can't because Wildfire Leshy. Oh, that's right. Oh, well, then she'll have to figure it out.
And you took the Rogue, which was the closest to fighter that was left. She has to play a caster.
I'm going to take the Gamayan just because I love the Gamayan. So
that's going to be on Friday at 4 p.m. Eastern, which is going to be 7 p.m. No. Which is 7 p.m. Eastern.
Other way around. 4 p.m. Pacific, 7 p.m. Eastern. I said
it right the second time.
And then on Saturday, all day, we have basically a block of content from 11 a.m. Pacific to 1 p.m. Pacific. 1 p.m. Pacific is the big one. That's where we're going through all of our new products and all of our new items that are coming out.
It ends at 2 p.m.
Pacific. It ends at 2 p.m.
The last stream starts at 1.
Yeah, and so it goes from 1 to 2, but you can just watch, and then all these videos will be on here. But I'm sure if you're watching this much later, you'll be like, hey, they already announced that stuff. That stuff's probably out by now, but you'll be new to
on the stream.
If you're on the stream, it's new to you. So there you go. Are you going to Gen Con at all, Dave, this year?
I have never been to a convention.
Oh my! You have to go. That's all I do.
I would love to.
Oh my God, there's so much fun.
I have difficulty finding traveling companions when all of my friends are.
I go by myself. You don't need companions.
I'm way more shy than you.
Most people are.
Yeah.
Even plan to having people at convention. Step 1, reserve 12 tickets. Step 2, when people are like, oh, I don't know if I have a ticket or not, Steve.
I do that.
I've got extra tickets.
That's how I met Vanessa. Vanessa won a contest. Now you have people. Vanessa Hoskins, who's now on Roll for Combat, who runs basically.
But she's the guest of honor.
No for direction.
She certainly got a free
the guest of honor. No. When the first time she went to PaizoCon, she won a contest to go to PaizoCon from Roll for Combat, and that's how I met her. See, it all stemmed from that. See, that's what you have to do, Dave. If you go to a convention, you two could end up being guest of honor.
It's on the bucket list. I need to do it.
Wow. I'd say PaizoCon or Gen Con. Yeah. Gen Con's a little crazy, but it's awesome. I've never been to Origins. I'm going this year, and it's supposed to be really good. Everyone loves Origins. So those are the 3 big ones. Dragon Con I also heard is really good. I've never been to it.
I've been to Origins before, and it's a good crew of
PAX Unplugged
people that are around.
Is also really good. I will
say that their on-site booklet is not very well organized.
No, but they have a lot of good board games, and it's much calmer. Gen Con is insanity. It's fun, but oof. A lot. It's a lot to take in.
It's too many sights and sounds. When I'm in the dealer hall, everything is so cool that I can never decide what to actually approach.
I'm from Manhattan, and it's even too much for me. So it's a lot. Let me tell you, it takes a lot out of you. PaizoCon, small, intimate fun. And PAX Unplugged, good medium, good middle ground. Not too big, not too small. It's in Philly. It's easy to get to. It's in December. That's the one.
All right. Well, good question, Gina B, but that's where we'll be this weekend.
Yes. Anyhow, with that, we will probably see you next week. Maybe
We're
on
hoping.
Tuesday. Might be Wednesday. I'm coming back Monday night, so we'll see how I feel after PaizoCon. Usually, you usually need a day or two after these conventions to decompress, so we'll see. But thanks again, Dave, and I'm sure you'll be on the channel many more times.
Well, I look forward to it. It's fun.
Okay.